Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we begin our march through the works of Dr. Samuel Johnson. This is one author that I am not familiar with as far as reading his primary works. I'm familiar with him through reputation, especially his influence on literary criticism. And of course, there is the well known Life of Johnson by James Boswell, and we will be reading that at the conclusion of finishing the works of Dr. Johnson. So, with that said, we will get started. We are beginning with The Rambler, which is a series of essays that he wrote from 1750 to 1752. There are 208 of them. I've tried to find the whole thing on YouTube, and I've not been able to find the entire 208 essays. I've seen bits and pieces uploaded by different people reading them. Some of them are very good readings, by the way, much better than I can do. But I've not seen the whole thing. So this might be the only place you can find them for free. That is, supposing that you can find them for pay somewhere else. I'm not even sure of that. So with that said, I will begin with number one. All of these, it seems, begin with a Latin quotation, followed by a quotation in English. I have decided to read the Latin quotation in English because if I attempt it in Latin, I'll just butcher it, and those of you who understand Latin wouldn't be able to understand what I'm saying anyway. So I'm doing a simple copy paste into a translator and then reading what that is. And hopefully that suffices for what we are doing here. I'm hopeful that it will. And with that said, we will get started with number one, which is dated Tuesday, March 20th, 1750. Why, however, should I rather run through the plain through which the great disciple of Aranca bent his horses? If you are free and accept the reason of peace, I will eat. Juvenal. Why to expatiate in this beaten field? Why arms, oft used in vain, I mean to wield? If time permit and candor will attend, some satisfaction this essay may lend. Elphinston. The difficulty of the first address on any new occasion is felt by every man in his transactions with the world, and confessed by the settled and regular forms of salutation, which necessity has introduced into all languages. Judgment was wearied with the perplexity of being forced upon choice, where there was no motive to preference, and it was found convenient that some easy method of introduction should be established, which, if it wanted the allurement of novelty, might enjoy the security of prescription. Perhaps few authors have presented themselves before the public without wishing that such ceremonial modes of entrance had been anciently established, as might have freed them from those dangers which the desire of pleasing is certain to produce, and precluded the vain expedients of softening the censure by apologies, or arousing attention by abruptness. The epic writers have found the proemial part of the poem such an addition to their undertaking that they have almost unanimously adopted the first lines of Homer, and the reader needs only to be informed of the subject to know in what manner the poem will begin. But this solemn repetition is hitherto the peculiar distinction of heroic poetry. It has never been legally extended to the lower orders of literature. That seems to be considered as a hereditary privilege, to be enjoyed only by those who claim it from their alliance to the genius of Homer. The rules which the injudicious use of this prerogative suggested to Horace may indeed be applied to the direction of candidates for inferior fame. It may be proper for all to remember that they ought not to raise expectation which it is not in their power to satisfy, and that it is more pleasing to see smoke brightening into flame than flame sinking into smoke. This precept has long been received, both from regard to the authority of Horace and its conformity to the general opinion of the world. Yet there have always been some, that thought it no deviation from modesty to recommend their own labors, and imagined themselves entitled by indisputable merit to an exemption from general restraints, and to elevations not allowed in common life. They perhaps believed that when, like Thucydides, they bequeathed to mankind an estate forever, it was an additional favor to inform them of its value. It may indeed be no less dangerous to claim, on certain occasions, too little than too much. There is something captivating in spirit and intrepidity, to which we often yield, as to a restless power. Nor can he reasonably expect the confidence of others, who too apparently distrusts himself. Plutarch, in his enumeration of the various occasions on which a man may without just offense proclaim his own excellencies, has omitted the case of an author entering the world, unless it may be comprehended under his general position, that a man may lawfully praise himself for those qualities which cannot be known but from his own mouth, as when he is among strangers and can have no opportunity of actual exertion of his powers. That the case of an author is parallel will scarcely be granted, because he necessarily discovers the degree of his merit to his judges when he appears at his trial. But it should be remembered that unless his judges are inclined to favor him, they will hardly be persuaded to hear the cause. In love, the state which fills the heart with the degree of solicitude, next to that of an author, it has been held a maxim that success is most easily obtained by indirect and unperceived approaches. He who too soon professes himself a lover raises obstacles to his own wishes, and those whom disappointments have taught experience endeavor to conceal their passion till they believe their mistress wishes for the discovery. The same method, if it were practicable to writers, would save many complaints of the severity of the age and the caprices of criticism. If a man could glide imperceptibly into the favor of the public, and only proclaim his pretensions to literary honors when he is sure of not being rejected, he might commence author with better hopes, as his failings might escape contempt, though he shall never attain much regard. But since the world supposes every man that writes ambitious of applause, as some ladies have taught themselves to believe that every man intends love who expresses civility, the miscarriage in any endeavor in learning raises an unbounded contempt, indulged by most minds without scruple, as an honest triumph over unjust claims and exorbitant expectations. The artifices of those who put themselves in this hazardous state have therefore been multiplied in proportion to their fear as well as their ambition, and are to be looked upon with more indulgence as they are incited at once by the two great movers of the human mind, the desire of good and the fear of evil. For who can wonder that, allured on one side and frightened on the other, some should endeavor to gain favor by bribing the judge with an appearance of respect which they do not feel, to excite compassion by confessing weakness of which they are not convinced, and others to attract regard by a show of openness and magnanimity, by a daring profession of their own deserts, and a public challenge of honors and rewards. The ostentatious and haughty display of themselves has been the usual refuge of diurnal writers, in vindication of whose practice it may be said that what it wants in prudence is supplied by sincerity, and who at least may plead that if their boasts deceive any into the perusal of their performances, they defraud them of but little time. Quote, "For what? One rushes, in a moment of an hour comes hasty death, or a joyful victory." Horace. The battle join, and in a moment's flight, death or a joyful conquest ends the fight. Francis. The question concerning the merit of the day is soon decided, and we are not condemned to toil through half a folio to be convinced that the writer has broken his promise. It is one among many reasons for which I purpose to endeavor the entertainment of my countrymen by a short essay on Tuesday and Saturday, that I hope not much to tire those whom I shall not happen to please, and if I am not commended for the beauty of my works, to be at least pardoned for their brevity. But whether my expectations are most fixed on pardon or praise, I think it not necessary to discover. For having accurately weighed the reasons for arrogance and submission, I find them so nearly equiponderant that my impatience to try the event of my first performance will not suffer me to attend any longer the trepidations of the balance. There are indeed many conveniences almost peculiar to this method of publication, which may naturally flatter the author, whether he be confident or timorous. The man to whom the extent of his knowledge or the sprightliness of his imagination has, in his own opinion, already secured the praises of the world, willingly takes that way of displaying his abilities, which will soonest give him an opportunity of hearing the voice of fame. It heightens his alacrity to think in how many places he shall hear what he is now writing, read with ecstasies tomorrow. He will often please himself with reflecting that the author of a large treatise must proceed with anxiety, lest before the completion of his work the attention of the public may have changed its object, but that he who is confined to no single topic may follow the national taste through all its variations, and catch the aurora popularis, the gale of favor, from what point soever it shall blow. Nor is the prospect less likely to ease the doubts of the cautious and the terrors of the fearful, for to such the shortness of every single paper is a powerful encouragement. He that questions his abilities to arrange the dissimilar parts of an extensive plan, or fears to be lost in a complicated system, may yet hope to adjust a few pages without perplexity. And if, when he turns over the repositories of his memory, he finds his collection too small for a volume, he may yet have enough to furnish out an essay. He that would fear to lay out too much time upon an experiment of which he knows not the event, persuades himself that a few days will show him what he is to expect from his learning and his genius. If he thinks his own judgment not sufficiently enlightened, he may, by attending the remarks which every paper will produce, rectify his opinions. If he should with too little premeditation encumber himself by an unwieldy subject, he can quit it without confessing his ignorance, and pass to other topics less dangerous or more tractable. And if he finds, with all his industry and all his artifices, that he cannot deserve regard or cannot attain it, he may let the design fall at once, and without injury to others or himself, retire to amusements of greater pleasure, or to studies of better prospect. End of Essay 1. Essay 2, Saturday, March 24th, 1750. Quote, "He does not know how to stand still. 1,000 traces perish. Auntie's flight and his heavy hoof strikes the absent field." Statius. The impatient courser pants in every vein, and pawing seems to beat the distant plain. Hills, vales, and floods appear already crossed, and ere he starts, 1,000 steps are lost. Pope. That the mind of man is never satisfied with the objects immediately before it, but is always breaking away from the present moment, and losing itself in schemes of future felicity, and that we forget the proper use of the time, now in our power to provide for the enjoyment of that which, perhaps, may never be granted us, has been frequently remarked. And as this practice is a commodious subject of raillery to the gay, and of declamation to the serious, it has been ridiculed with all the pleasantry of wit, and exaggerated with all the amplifications of rhetoric. Every instance by which its absurdity might appear most flagrant has been studiously collected. It has been marked with every epithet of contempt, and all the tropes and figures have been called forth against it. Censure is willingly indulged, because it always implies some superiority. Men please themselves with imagining that they have made a deeper search or wider survey than others, and detected faults and follies which escape vulgar observation. And the pleasure of wantoning in common topics is so tempting to a writer that he cannot easily resign it. A train of sentiments generally received enables him to shine without labor, and to conquer without a contest. It is so easy to laugh at the folly of him who lives only in idea, refuses immediate ease for distant pleasures, and, instead of enjoying the blessings of life, lets life glide away in preparations to enjoy them. It affords such opportunities of triumphant exaltation to exemplify the uncertainty of the human state, to rouse mortals from their dream, and inform them of the silent celerity of time, that we may believe authors willing rather to transmit than examine so advantageous a principle, and more inclined to pursue a track so smooth and so flowery than attentively to consider whether it leads to truth. This quality of looking forward into futurity seems the unavoidable condition of a being whose motions are gradual and whose life is progressive. As his powers are limited, he must use means for the attainment of his ends, and intend first what he performs last, as by continual advances from his first stage of existence he is perpetually varying the horizon of his prospects. He must always discover new motives of action, new excitements of fear and allurements of desire. The end, therefore, which at present calls forth our efforts, will be found, when it is once gained, to be only one of the means to some remoter end. The natural flights of the human mind are not from pleasure to pleasure, but from hope to hope. He that directs his steps to a certain point must frequently turn his eyes to that place which he strives to reach. He that undergoes the fatigue of labor must solace his weariness with the contemplation of its reward. In agriculture, one of the most simple and necessary employments, no man turns up the ground but because he thinks of the harvest, that harvest which blights may intercept, which inundations may sweep away, or which death or calamity may hinder him from reaping. Yet as few maxims are widely received or long retained but for some conformity with truth and nature, it must be confessed that this caution against the keeping of our view too intent upon remote advantages is not without its propriety or usefulness, though it may have been recited with too much levity, or enforced with too little distinction. For not to speak of that vehemence of desire which presses through right and wrong to its gratification, or that anxious inquietude which is justly chargeable with distrust of heaven, subjects too solemn for my present purpose. It frequently happens that, by indulging early the raptures of success, we forget the measures necessary to secure it, and suffer the imagination to riot in the fruition of some possible good, till the time of obtaining it has slipped away. There would, however, be few enterprises of great labor or hazard undertaken if we had not the power of magnifying the advantages which we persuade ourselves to expect from them. When the Knight of La Mancha gravely recounts to his companion the adventures by which he is to signalize himself in such a manner that he shall be summoned to the support of empires, solicited to accept the heiress of the crown which he has preserved, have honors and riches to scatter about him, and an island to bestow on his worthy squire, very few readers, amidst their mirth or pity, can deny that they have admitted visions of the same kind, though they have not, perhaps, expected events equally strange, or by means equally inadequate. When we pity him, we reflect on our own disappointments, and when we laugh, our hearts inform us that he is not more ridiculous than ourselves, except that he tells us what we have only thought. The understanding of a man naturally sanguine may indeed be easily vitiated by luxurious indulgence of hope, however necessary to the production of everything great or excellent, as some plants are destroyed by too open exposure to that sun which gives life and beauty to the vegetable world. Perhaps no class of the human species requires more to be cautioned against this anticipation of happiness than those that aspire to the name of authors. A man of lively fancy no sooner finds a hint moving in his mind than he makes momentous excursions to the press and to the world, and with a little encouragement from flattery, pushes forward into future ages, and prognosticates the honors to be paid him when envy is extinct and faction forgotten, and those whom partiality now suffers to obscure him shall have given way to the triflers of as short a duration as themselves. Those who have proceeded so far as to appeal to the tribunal of succeeding times are not likely to be cured of their infatuation, but all endeavors ought to be used for the prevention of a disease, for which, when it has attained its height, perhaps no remedy will be found in the gardens of philosophy, however she may boast her psychic of the mind, her cathartics of vice, or lenitives of passion. I shall, therefore, while I am yet but lightly touched with the symptoms of the writer's malady, endeavor to fortify myself against the infection, not without some weak hope that my preservatives may extend their virtues to others, whose employment exposes them to the same danger. Quote, "You are swollen with love of praise. There are certain atonements which, when read thrice in a pure book, will be able to revive you." End quote. Horace. Is fame your passion? Wisdom's powerful charm, if thrice read over, shall its force disarm. Francis. It is the sage advice of Epictetus that a man should accustom himself often to think of what is most shocking and terrible, that by such reflections he may be preserved from too ardent wishes for seeming good, and from too much dejection in real evil. There is nothing more dreadful to an author than neglect, compared with which reproach, hatred, and opposition are names of happiness. Yet this worst, this meanest fate, everyone who dares to write has reason to fear. Quote, "I now meditate with you on the Canticle of Verses." End quote. Horace. "Go now and meditate thy tuneful lays." Elphinston. It may not be unfit for him who makes a new entrance into the lettered world so far to suspect his own powers as to believe that he possibly may deserve neglect, that nature may not have qualified him much to enlarge or embellish knowledge, nor sent him forth entitled by indisputable superiority to regulate the conduct of the rest of mankind. That, though the world must be granted to be yet in ignorance, he is not destined to dispel the cloud, nor to shine out as one of the luminaries of life. For this suspicion every catalogue of a library will furnish sufficient reason, as he will find it crowded with names of men, who, though now forgotten, were once no less enterprising or confident than himself, equally pleased with their own productions, equally caressed by their patrons, and flattered by their friends. But though it should happen that an author is capable of excelling, yet his merit may pass without notice, huddled in the variety of things and thrown into the general miscellany of life. He that endeavors after fame by writing solicits the regard of a multitude of fluctuating in pleasures, or immersed in business without time for intellectual amusements. He appeals to judges prepossessed by passions, or corrupted by prejudices, which preclude their approbation of any new performance. Some are too indolent to read anything till its reputation is established, others too envious to promote that fame which gives them pain by its increase. What is new is opposed, because most are unwilling to be taught, and what is known is rejected, because it is not sufficiently considered that men more frequently require to be reminded than informed. The learned are afraid to declare their opinion early, lest they should put their reputation in hazard. The ignorant always imagine themselves giving some proof of delicacy, when they refuse to be pleased, and he that finds his way to reputation through all these obstructions must acknowledge that he is indebted to other causes besides his industry, his learning, or his wit. End of Essay 2. Essay 3. Quote, "Virtue, ignorant of the sordid, repelled, shines with honors defiled, nor does it take or lay down an axe at the will of the popular breeze." End quote. Horace. Undisappointed in designs, with native honors virtue shines, nor takes up power, nor lays it down, as giddy rabbles smile or frown. Elphinston. The task of an author is either to teach what is not known, or to recommend known truths by his manner of adorning them. Either to let new light in upon the mind and open new scenes to the prospect, or to vary the dress and situation of common objects, so as to give them fresh grace and more powerful attractions, to spread such flowers over the regions through which the intellect has already made its progress, as may tempt it to return, and take a second view of things hastily passed over, or negligently regarded. Either of these labors is very difficult, because that they may not be fruitless, men must not be only persuaded of their errors, but reconciled to their guide. They must not only confess their ignorance, but what is still less pleasing, must allow that he from whom they are to learn is more knowing than themselves. It might be imagined that such employment was in itself sufficiently irksome and hazardous, that none would be found so malevolent as wantonly to add weight to the stone of Sisyphus, and that few endeavors would be used to obstruct those advances to reputation, which must be made at such an expense of time and thought, with so great hazard in the miscarriage, and with so little advantage from the success. Yet there is a certain race of men that either imagine it their duty, or make it their amusement, to hinder the reception of every work of learning or genius, who stand as sentinels in the avenues of fame, and value themselves upon giving ignorance and envy the first notice of a prey. To these men, who distinguish themselves by the appellation of critics, it is necessary for a new author to find some means of recommendation. It is probable that the most malignant of these persecutors might be somewhat softened and prevailed on for a short time to remit their fury. Having for this purpose considered many expedients, I find in the records of ancient times that Argus was lulled by music, and Cerberus quieted with a sop, and am therefore inclined to believe that modern critics, who if they have not the eyes, have the watchfulness of Argus, and can bark as loud as Cerberus, though perhaps they cannot bite with equal force, might be subdued by methods of the same kind. I have heard how some have been pacified with claret and a supper, and others laid asleep by the soft notes of flattery. Though the nature of my undertaking gives me sufficient reason to dread the united tax of this virulent generation, yet I have not hitherto persuaded myself to take any measures for flight or treaty, for I am in doubt whether they can act against me by lawful authority, and suspect that they have presumed upon forged commission, styled themselves the ministers of criticism, without any authentic evidence of delegation, and uttered their own determinations as the decrees of a higher judicature. Criticism, from whom they derived their claim to decide the fate of writers, was the eldest daughter of labor and of truth. She was at her birth committed to the care of justice, and brought up by her in the palace of wisdom. Being soon distinguished by the celestials for her uncommon qualities, she was appointed the governess of fancy, and empowered to beat time to the chorus of the Muses when they sung before the throne of Jupiter. When the Muses condescended to visit this lower world, they came accompanied by Criticism, to whom upon her descent from her native regions, Justice gave a scepter to be carried aloft in her right hand, one end of which was tinctured with ambrosia and enwreathed with the golden foliage of amaranths and bays. The other end was encircled with cypress and poppies, and dipped in the waters of oblivion. In her left hand she bore an unextinguishable torch, manufactured by labor, and lighted by truth, of which it was the particular quality immediately to show everything in its true form, however it might be disguised to common eyes. Whatever art could complicate, or folly could confound, was, upon the first gleam of the torch of truth, exhibited in its distinct parts and original simplicity. It darted through the labyrinths of sophistry, and showed at once all the absurdities to which they served for refuge. It pierced through the robes which rhetoric often sold to falsehood, and detected the disproportion of parts which artificial veils had been contrived to cover. Thus furnished for the execution of her office, criticism came down to survey the performance of those who professed themselves the votaries of the Muses. Whatever was brought before her, she beheld by the steady light of the torch of truth, and when her examination had convinced her that the laws of just writing had been observed, she touched it with the amaranthine end of the scepter, and consigned it over to immortality. But it more frequently happened that in the works which required her inspection there was some imposture attempted, that false colors were laboriously laid, that some secret inequality was found between the words and sentiments, or some dissimilitude of the ideas in the original objects, that incongruities were linked together, or that some parts were of no use but to enlarge the appearance of the whole, without contributing to its beauty, solidity, or usefulness. Wherever such discoveries were made, and they were made whenever these faults were committed, criticism refused the touch which conferred the sanction of immortality, and when the errors were frequent and gross, reserved the scepter, and let drops of lathe distill from the poppies and cypress a fatal mildew which immediately began to waste the work away, till it was at last totally destroyed. There were some compositions brought to the test, in which the strongest light was thrown upon them, their beauties and faults appeared so equally mingled, that criticism stood with her scepter poised in her hand, in doubt whether to shed lathe or ambrosia upon them. These at last increased to so great a number that she was weary of attending such doubtful claims, and for fear of using improperly the scepter of justice, referred the cause to be considered by time. The proceedings of time, though very dilatory, were, some few caprices excepted, conformable to justice, and many, who thought themselves secure by a short forbearance, have sunk under his scythe, as they were posting down with their volumes in triumph to futurity. It was observable that some were destroyed by little and little, and others crushed forever by a single blow. Criticism, having long accepted her eye fixed steadily upon time, was at last so well satisfied with his conduct that she withdrew from the earth with her patroness Astrea, and left justice and false taste to ravage at large as the associates of fraud and mischief, contenting herself thenceforth to shed her influence from afar upon some select minds, fitted for its reception by learning and by virtue. Before her departure she broke her scepter, of which the shivers that formed the ambrosial end were caught up by flattery, and those that had been infected with the waters of Lethe were, with equal haste, seized by malevolence. The followers of flattery, to whom she distributed her part of the scepter, neither had nor desired light, but touched indiscriminately whatever power or interest happened to exhibit. The companions of malevolence were supplied by the Furies with a torch, which had this quality peculiar to infernal luster, that its light fell only upon faults. No light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe. Milton. With these fragments of authority, the slaves of flattery and malevolence marched out, at the command of their mistresses, to confer immortality or condemn to oblivion. But the scepter had now lost its power, and time passes his sentence at leisure, without any regard to their determinations. End of Essay number 3. Essay 4. Saturday, March 31st, 1750. Quote, "To speak at the same time both delightful and suitable for life." End quote. Horace. "And join both profit and delight in one." Creech. The works of fiction with which the present generation seems more particularly delighted are such as exhibit life in its true state, diversified only by accidents that daily happen in the world, and influenced by passions and qualities which are really to be found in conversing with mankind. This kind of writing may be termed not improperly the comedy of romance, and is to be conducted nearly by the rules of comic poetry. Its province is to bring about natural events by easy means, and to keep up curiosity without the help of wonder. It is therefore precluded from the machines and expedients of the heroic romance, and can neither employ giants to snatch away a lady from the nuptial rites, nor knights to bring her back from captivity. It can neither bewilder its personages in deserts, nor lodge them in imaginary castles. I remember a remark made by Scaliger upon Pontanus that all his writings are filled with the same images, and that if you take him from his lilies and his roses, his satyrs and his dryads, he will have nothing left that can be called poetry. In like manner, almost all the fiction of the last age will vanish if you deprive them of a hermit and a wood, a battle and a shipwreck. Why this wild strain of imagination found reception so long in polite and learned ages, it is not easy to conceive. But we cannot wonder that while readers could be procured, the authors were willing to continue it. For when a man had by practice gained some fluency of language, he had no further care than to retire to his closet, let loose his invention, and heat his mind with incredibilities. A book was thus produced without fear of criticism, without the toil of study, without knowledge of nature or acquaintance with life. The task of our present writers is very different. It requires, together with that learning which is to be gained from books, that experience which can never be attained by solitary diligence, but must arise from general converse and accurate observation of the living world. Their performances have, as Horace expresses it, the more burden, the less forgiveness, little indulgence, and therefore more difficulty. They are engaged in portraits of which everyone knows the original, and can detect any deviation from exactness of resemblance. Other writings are safe, except from the malice of learning, but these are in danger from every common reader, as the slipper ill executed was censured by a shoemaker who happened to stop in his way at the Venus of Apollos. But the fear of not being approved as just copiers of human manners is not the most important concern that an author of this sort ought to have before him. These books are written chiefly to the young, the ignorant, and the idle, to whom they serve as lectures of conduct and introductions into life. They are the entertainments of minds unfurnished with ideas, and therefore easily susceptible of impressions, not fixed by principles, and therefore easily following the current of fancy, not informed by experience, and consequently open to every false suggestion and partial account. That the highest degree of reverence should be paid to youth, and that nothing indecent should be suffered to approach their eyes or ears, are precepts extorted by sense and virtue from an ancient writer, by no means eminent for chastity of thought. The same kind, though not the same degree, of caution is required in everything which is laid before them, to secure them from the unjust prejudices, perverse opinions, and incongruous combinations of images. In the romances formerly written, every transaction and sentiment was so remote from all that passes among men, that the reader was in very little danger of making any applications to himself. The virtues and crimes were equally beyond his sphere of activity, and he amused himself with heroes and with traitors, deliverers and persecutors, as with beings of another species, whose actions were regulated upon motives of their own, and who had neither faults nor excellencies in common with himself. But when an adventurer is leveled with the rest of the world, and acts in such scenes of the universal drama as may be the lot of any other man, young spectators fix their eyes upon him with closer attention, and hope by observing his behavior and success to regulate their own practices when they shall be engaged in the like part. For this reason, these familiar histories may perhaps be made of greater use than the solemnities of professed morality, and convey the knowledge of vice and virtue with more efficacy than axioms and definitions. But if the power of example is so great as to take possession of the memory by a kind of violence, and produce effects almost without the intervention of the will, care ought to be taken that, when the choice is unrestrained, the best examples only should be exhibited, and that which is likely to operate so strongly should not be mischievous or uncertain in its effects. The chief advantage which these fictions have over real life is that their authors are at liberty, though not to invent, yet to select objects, and to cull from the mass of mankind those individuals upon which the attention ought most to be employed. As a diamond, though it cannot be made, may be polished by art, and placed in such a situation as to display that luster which before was buried among common stones. It is justly considered as the greatest excellency of art to imitate nature, but it is necessary to distinguish those parts of nature which are most proper for imitation. Greater care is still required in representing life, which is so often discolored by passion or deformed by wickedness. If the world be promiscuously described, I cannot see of what use it can be to read the account, or why it may not be as safe to turn the eye immediately upon mankind as upon a mirror, which shows all that presents itself without discrimination. It is therefore not a sufficient vindication of a character that it is drawn as it appears, for many characters ought never to be drawn, nor of a narrative that the train of events is agreeable to observation and experience, for that observation which is called knowledge of the world will be found much more frequently to make men cunning than good. The purpose of these writings is surely not only to show mankind, but to provide that they may be seen hereafter with less hazard, to teach the means of avoiding the snares which are laid by treachery for innocence, without infusing any wish for that superiority with which the betrayer flatters his vanity, to give the power of counteracting fraud, without the temptation to practice it, to initiate youth by mock encounters in the art of necessary defense, and to increase prudence without impairing virtue. Many writers, for the sake of following nature, so mingle good and bad qualities in their principal personages that they are both equally conspicuous, and as we accompany them through their adventures with delight, and are led by degrees to interest ourselves in their favor, we lose the abhorrence of their faults, because they do not hinder our pleasure, or perhaps regard them with some kindness for being united with so much merit. There have been men, indeed, splendidly wicked, whose endowments threw a brightness on their crimes, and whom scarce any villainy made perfectibly detestable, because they never could be wholly divested of their excellencies. But such have been in all ages the great corrupters of the world, and their resemblance ought no more to be preserved than the art of murdering without pain. Some have advanced, without due attention to the consequences of this notion, that certain virtues have their correspondent faults, and therefore that to exhibit either apart is to deviate from probability. Thus men are observed by Swift to be grateful in the same degree as they are resentful. This principle, with others of the same kind, supposes man to act from a brute impulse, and pursue a certain degree of inclination without any choice of the object. For otherwise, though it should be allowed that gratitude and resentment arise from the same constitution of the passions, it follows not that they will be equally indulged when reason is consulted. Yet unless that consequence be admitted, this sagacious maxim becomes an empty sound, without any relation to practice or to life. Nor is it evident that even the first motions to these effects are always in the same proportion. For pride, which produces quickness of resentment, will obstruct gratitude, by unwillingness to admit that inferiority which obligation implies. And it is very unlikely that he who cannot think he receives a favor will acknowledge or repay it. It is of the utmost importance to mankind that positions of this tendency should be laid open and confuted. For while men consider good and evil as springing from the same root, they will spare the one for the sake of the other, and in judging if not of others, at least of themselves, will be apt to estimate their virtues by their vices. To this fatal error all those will contribute who confound the colors of right and wrong, and instead of helping settle their boundaries, mix them with so much art that no common mind is able to disunite them. In narratives where historical veracity has no place, I cannot discover why there should not be exhibited the most perfect idea of virtue not angelical, nor above probability, for what we cannot credit we shall never imitate. But the highest and purest that humanity can reach, which, exercised in such trials as the various revolutions of things shall bring upon it, may, by conquering some calamities and enduring others, teach us what we may hope and what we can perform. Vice, for vice is necessary to be shown, should always disgust, nor should the graces of gaiety or the dignity of courage be so united with it as to reconcile it to the mind. Wherever it appears, it should raise hatred by the malignity of its practices, and contempt by the meanness of its stratagems. For while it is supported by either parts or spirit, it will be seldom heartily abhorred. The Roman tyrant was content to be hated if he was but feared, and there are thousands of the readers of romances willing to be thought wicked if they be allowed to be wits. It is therefore to be steadily inculcated that virtue is the highest proof of understanding, and the only solid basis of greatness, and that vice is the natural consequence of narrow thoughts, that it begins in mistake and ends in ignominy. End of Essay 4. This is the end of Part 1 of The Rambler by Dr. Samuel Johnson. Thank you for listening.